So much of this book is actually about the saga, and I don't think that's too strong a word, of trying to get to a deal with the Iranians and going back and forth, and time spent in Vienna and time spent in Oman, all over the world. Explain to us how you got there and why it was important, because it's very much up for grabs right now.
Yes, it's very much up for grabs right now. Look, the President of the United States, Barack Obama, understood that we were in a very tough place with not a lot of great alternatives. Iran was on the path to get a nuclear weapon, which would mean they could project enormous power, even more so than they currently have, into the Middle East and deter our actions and really send the oil markets all over the place in ways that would not be good for the world economy. And so he thought, well, I could bomb all the sites, and he even commissioned a weapon that would be able to do underground sites, but that might lead to a broader war, and you can't bomb away someone's knowledge. So he knew, and even the critics knew, that Iran would recreate those facilities and probably do so underground and in secret, and we'd have to bomb again in another couple of years. He could try to keep sanctions on, but sanctions don't stop a nuclear program. They just get people to a negotiating table. We can come back to that in terms of what President Trump is currently doing. In fact, when the Europeans started negotiating with Iran, they had, in the early 2000s, they had 164 centrifuges. By the time we all got really serious about the negotiations, they had 19,000 centrifuges, even with all of those sanctions, quite egregious sanctions on them. So he thought negotiations were the way to go. He established a secret channel helped by then chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, John Kerry, who had established a relationship with the Sultan of Oman, who was the conduit for these discussions. That was brought into the multilateral negotiation, which I led under Secretary Obama and, of course, Secretary Kerry, Secretary Moniz of Energy. But this was, in my case, a 4-year undertaking, while I also had responsibility for all the rest of the world.
So, Ambassador Sherman, you mentioned President Trump. President Trump has been very outspoken, of course, in his criticisms of the Iran deal. And some of the things he says sort of make some sense, in the sense that don't we have the right to go in wherever we want into military sites and try to inspect them? Why didn't we deal with ICBMs? Why didn't we deal with their subsidies of terrorist groups throughout the Middle East? Those must have been on the agenda at some point. You would have certainly spotted them.
Sure. Well, in terms of the military side, he's actually not correct about that. This agreement has a provision that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. And the provision is that if we bring to the International Atomic Energy Agency some evidence, credible evidence that we are concerned about a military site, there is a process that can't go on any longer than 28 days, and you cannot get rid of evidence around nuclear materials in 28 days. If at the end of that 28 days, Iran has not provided access or provided a legitimate alternative, then the IAEA gets access. So that criticism is actually not accurate. The criticism and the concern about long-range missiles, about their terrorist activities in the Middle East, there is a provision in the UN Security Council about long-range missiles, and in fact, any capable of carrying a nuclear weapon. And in fact, we have sanctions already, unilateral, on all of that technology. But if you put everything into one agreement, then you negotiate against yourself. So Iran says, well, OK, I'll consider having Hezbollah not launch so many rockets into Israel, which would be a good thing, of course, but I want to be able to keep more advanced centrifuges. So you neither get what you need on the terrorism side or the missile side, nor do you get what you need on the nuclear side. So the president decided that we needed to get nuclear weapons off the table so that we could turn our attention and all of our strategy, continue our attention, because we already had lots of sanctions on Iran on all of these other issues, to pursue a strategy with our partners in the Gulf and, of course, with our ally and partner Israel, to stop their nefarious and malign behavior in the Middle East.
So Mr. Solano, Javier Solano, who used to run NATO, actually was out just today saying he entirely supports the agreement that you negotiated. At the same time, he says as a practical matter, it is impossible for the Europeans not to go along with it. He says the power of the U.S. today is not military, it's the dollar. They squeeze you out. He's saying to his European colleagues, you don't have any choice. You have to go along with whatever sanctions the United States imposes. Do you agree with him?
Indeed, sadly, I probably do. I say probably because the Europeans are trying to create some financial facilities that will help small and medium enterprises to invest in Iran. All of the big companies, Siemens, Allianz, Peugeot, they're all gone from Iran already because they need American markets. And the secondary economic sanctions that are going to be put in place at the beginning of November means that if you do business with the Central Bank of Iran, you cannot do business with an American bank. Most companies cannot survive under that. Now, there are risks here. Which actually, when Jack Lew was Treasury Secretary, he pointed out, we have to be very careful about using these secondary economic sanctions, because if we use them too often, then the world will say, well, let's not have the dollar be the reserve currency anymore. Let's create a basket of currencies so we're not just relying on the dollar. In addition, because of the tariffs the president has put on, we are squeezing our allies and our partners in all kinds of directions, again, pressing them to find other alternatives to our very powerful economic power. And then finally, if you look at Russia's economy, which is very challenged, the ruble has come to mean nothing, but oil is traded in dollars. And so when these secondary economic sanctions go on, then the price of oil will go up higher, and Russia will make out like a bandit. And that's not in our national security interest.
I want to also turn to another part of the book that you talk about North Korea, because you spent a lot of time negotiating with them, too, under the Clinton administration. And as I recall, President Clinton was negotiating up to almost the last moment he was in office to try to get a deal. Didn't happen. As you look at what President Trump is doing right now with North Korea, is he making progress? He's got them to the table, after all.
I think it is good that North Korea is not testing missiles or testing nuclear weapons, but the International Atomic Energy Agency and our own intelligence community has said that they are progressing in secret on their nuclear program, on their long-range ballistic missile program. I supported the president having a summit with Kim Jong-un because these are both leaders who believe they're the only ones who matter. Now, in our system, that's not actually accurate. We have checks and balances. It is accurate in Kim Jong-un's system. But I was only for such a summit if there was a plan, a detailed plan going in, if there was a team to follow up to do the negotiations, because they're very complex, very difficult. This is much tougher than the Iran negotiation, quite frankly, because I don't believe North Korea has any intention of giving up their nuclear weapons. So this is a slog, very, very tough. The president has just announced under Secretary Pompeo a new envoy, Steve Biegun, who's a capable professional, was head of government relations for the Ford Motor Company for decades. So he's a very capable guy. But every time the president says something, it pulls the rug out from under his colleagues. The president said he was ready to get with Kim Jong-un without condition. Secretary Pompeo said, no, here are the conditions. But now we're hearing that, in fact, a second summit is underway. I hope that this one is better prepared and better followed up on than the last one.
So finally, Ambassador Sherman, I'm going to ask you a personal question for a very specific reason. This is a rather personal book in many respects. It really is your personal experience with this. You have labored long and hard on some things you care powerfully about. North Korea back in the 90s, and then more recently the Iran nuclear deal. How does it feel? How is it to have spent that much time, that much effort, and one deal didn't get done, and the other one looks like it's getting undone? It must be difficult not to be discouraged.
Well, I think what we know about diplomacy, and the reason the book is called What It Is that it's not for the faint of heart any more than life is. Even world wars may repeat themselves. When World War I happened, we said it was the war to end all wars. And less than 20 years later, we had World War II, which was catastrophic for a very long time. So this isn't for the faint of heart. One has to persist. And try again, because our security depends on it. So, yes, it was personally tough the day the president pulled out of the deal. I knew it was coming. It was still personally tough for the team and the hundreds of U.S. personnel who made this deal happen, as well as my colleagues and partners around the world who worked so hard on this. But at the end of the day, the real cost here is to America's prosperity and America's national security. And the president has put those at risk, in my view.